They stood beside the most powerful men on earth, and often paid the price for it. Some smiled through scandal, some rewrote history in the margins, others were ghosts with pearls. This is not a story about decoration. It's a story about influence without authority, sacrifice without nameplates, and the quiet warfare of public womanhood. Behind every president was a woman the world underestimated, and behind her, a truth no one wanted to see. These are the first ladies of the United States. Martha Washington, George Washington. She was the first lady, before that was even a thing. Martha Dandridge Custis Washington didn't campaign, didn't pose, and didn't ask for the job. But she showed up anyway, mostly because everyone told her to, and because her husband had this annoying habit of inventing things. Countries mostly. The year was 1789. The Constitution had been ratified. America was in the toddler phase of nationhood, wobbling, temperamental, prone to soiling itself in public. Enter George Washington, stoic demigod of the Revolution, and trailing behind him, mostly out of duty and not at all for fun, Martha. She was twice widowed, extremely rich, and had no desire to live in New York or Philadelphia, where the temporary capitals were. She loved Mount Vernon. She loved her privacy. And she loved not having to talk to powdered wig diplomats with bad breath and big ideas. But George got elected, and suddenly Martha had to entertain people who called themselves the new nobility, which sounded suspiciously like the old one they'd just fought a war to get rid of. There was no White House, there was no precedent, there wasn't even a defined job. But Martha's role became clear: be polite, throw dinners, stand still while everyone stares at you, and most importantly, never express political opinions. Even though she had plenty, she could be gracious, she could be steel. She kept her sharp tongue behind closed doors and her loyalty even tighter, especially when George started his silent brooding thing, which he did a lot. She hosted Friday night levees, formal receptions with stiff rules. No dancing, no card games, no gossip. Think colonial networking event, but with more corsets and less smiling. Despite the performative dignity, Martha hated it. "I am more like a state prisoner than anything else," she wrote. She couldn't leave the house without an escort. She couldn't receive guests without planning. Her personal mail was read by Congress. Her life had been traded for a position that didn't even have a name yet. It was like watching someone build a cage around her in real time, out of expectations. She'd already buried a husband. She'd already buried 4 children. By the time George became president, she had outlived more people than she cared to count. The revolution had taken its toll, not just in blood, but in what it asked women like Martha to become. Symbols of dignity, of self-sacrifice, of everything that made America look moral when the cameras were rolling, even if morality was mostly just powdered sugar over a rotting tooth. And while George set the tone for the presidency, Martha set the tone for first ladies to come. Project stability, wear your grief under lace, and pretend it's all worth it. When George finally stepped down, Martha practically ran back to Mount Vernon. She was done. She burned their correspondence, over 300 letters. Only a handful survived. Some call that romantic, others call it strategic. After all, what does it mean to be the wife of a national myth? And to know the man beneath it? We may never know what she thought about the revolution's compromises, or about slavery, which she inherited, managed, and never openly denounced. Her image remains dignified, but dignity, like politics, has a body count. Martha Washington didn't want to be remembered. She wanted peace. She wanted privacy. She wanted Mount Vernon and no one bothering her with the Republic's unfinished business. But she got none of that. Instead, she became the blueprint. A woman trapped by duty, a mother to a country that gave her no real voice, and a name that history still puts on coins, portraits, and textbooks with no footnotes. But what happens when the next First Lady wants more than a ceremonial smile? She writes letters. She thinks in revolutions. And when her husband dies in political disgrace, she keeps writing, because someone has to tell the truth. Abigail Adams, John Adams, before the White House had its marble columns, before the Constitution had its final ink, Abigail Adams was already writing the kind of history that men would later forget to cite. She wasn't just the second First Lady. She was the first to leave behind a voice, and that voice did not ask politely. The letter that should have changed everything. "Remember the ladies," she wrote to her husband in March of 1776. while he sat in Philadelphia deciding the fate of a nation. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't symbolic. It was a demand. She warned that if women weren't given representation, they would foment a rebellion of their own. Her tone was dry, sharp, and utterly unamused. We will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. This wasn't coming from a salon intellectual or a backroom radical. This was Abigail, a farmer's daughter, mother of 6, wife of a founding father, who somehow saw 200 years ahead. John Adams laughed. "As to your extraordinary code of laws," he replied, "I cannot but laugh." And just like that, women were officially forgotten in the American experiment. Abigail, however, did not forget, and she never shut up. A mind sharper than the bayonet, she was John Adams' most trusted advisor, whether the world wanted her to be or not. He wrote to her constantly, called her Portia, after the wise woman in Shakespeare, shared with her his fears, his rage, his policies, and often waited for her thoughts before making decisions. If John was the architect, Abigail was the moral engineer. She read political theory, debated ethics, and criticized the hypocrisies of slavery and inequality with the kind of bluntness that would have made even Jefferson wince. She managed their farm, raised children, survived smallpox, endured separation for years while John chased revolution, and never stopped writing. Her letters, almost 1,200 of them, form a running commentary on a country trying to be born and a woman trying to be heard inside it. No powdered wig, no parlor games, just ink, fire, and a refusal to be erased. The presidency no one asked for. When John Adams became president in 1797, Abigail entered a world that barely knew what to do with her. She held receptions with calculated charm, but never aspired to Martha Washington's polite distance. She gave political advice openly, often attending congressional debates from the gallery. A shocking move for the time. She was called Mrs. President behind her back. And not as a compliment. She defended the Alien and Sedition Acts, a black mark on the Adams administration, not out of tyranny, but fear. Fear that the revolution would collapse under its own chaos. Fear that everything they'd built would burn faster than it formed. In the panic, she became what she warned others not to become, a protector of authority. It didn't save them. John lost re-election. Thomas Jefferson, her ideological enemy, took power. And Abigail left the capital, bitter, bruised, and more convinced than ever that the men she stood beside had no idea what they were doing. Legacy is a paper trail of warnings. Abigail Adams is remembered as a proto-feminist, a moral compass, a woman of letters. But what if she was more than that? What if she was a ghost of what could have been? A vision of a republic where women weren't ornamental, where intellect mattered more than etiquette, where power wasn't confined to the ballot or the battlefield, but ran through every ink-stained letter written by a woman who knew too much and was heard too little. She was never given a formal title. Her influence never had a job description, but behind closed doors, Abigail was already the kind of first lady the country wasn't ready for. Sharp-tongued, politically active, and utterly disinterested in being agreeable. She didn't ask to be remembered, but she left the receipts. And then came the man who hated parties, avoided women, and wrote the Declaration of Independence with the ink of a widower. His wife never saw the White House, but her daughter stood in for her, and that ghost, the absence of a first lady, shaped everything that came next. Martha Jefferson Randolph, Thomas Jefferson. There's no official portrait of Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson in the White House, because she never lived there, because she was dead. She died at age 33, long before Thomas Jefferson became president. But her absence, her silence, shaped the role of First Lady more than any smiling portrait ever could. And in that absence stepped her daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, the original stand-in, the ceremonial ghost, the woman who filled the role of First Lady by pretending the position didn't exist, a country with no queen and no mother. Martha Jefferson died in 1782, 2 decades before her husband took office. She asked him for one thing on her deathbed, that he never remarry. He promised, and then he wept for weeks, writing in his diary only once, just a slash of ink and silence. Jefferson never spoke of her again, not in public, not in private. She became a shadow stitched into his legacy, a woman erased by grief and replaced by ritual. And yet, When he was elected president in 1800, the role of hostess needed filling. Enter his daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, who was raised on Enlightenment ideals, spoke fluent French, and had spent her childhood in both revolution and refinement. She was educated in Paris, mother of 12, and utterly unequipped for the political theater of Washington, D.C., but she did it anyway, because someone had to. The invisible lady of a very visible man. Unlike Abigail Adams, who wrote fiercely and openly, Martha Jefferson Randolph avoided the spotlight with surgical precision. She acted as hostess only when required, and even then she vanished from records as quickly as she appeared. She threw no grand receptions, she made no political statements, she gave no interviews, wrote no manifestos, left no paper trail. She was a placeholder, a living stand-in for a woman the public had never met. But invisibility is not the same as irrelevance. Martha Randolph managed the social balance of Jefferson's famously awkward administration. She diffused gossip, soothed egos, and played moral buffer in a capital that was quickly becoming the new Roman Forum, full of ambition, scandal, and carefully sharpened knives. And she did all this while quietly raising children, including her own and Jefferson's other, unacknowledged ones. The Hemmings question. Here's where the veil thins. While Martha Jefferson Randolph served tea and politeness upstairs, downstairs lived Sally Hemings, her aunt by blood, her father's enslaved mistress, and the mother of her half-siblings. A fact everyone knew and no one dared speak of. Martha never publicly acknowledged this arrangement. She lived with it, likely despised it, almost certainly resented it. But the truth was simpler and crueler. In a house built on contradiction, silence was the family business. Martha wasn't just standing in for her mother. She was standing in for a legacy that refused to name its sins. She was white Southern womanhood at its most performative. Cultivated, composed, and quietly complicit. Her role was not to confront hypocrisy, but to cushion it with grace. The First Lady who wasn't. She never called herself First Lady. The term hadn't quite stuck yet anyway, and yet she set the pattern for what would come. Women who worked in the margins, managed public appearances like battlefields, and swallowed private truths like arsenic. Martha Jefferson Randolph did not build a legacy. She preserved someone else's, and she did so while knowing full well that the house she smiled in was built with stolen labor, that the liberty her father wrote about wasn't for everyone, and that the woman who should have stood where she stood had been gone for decades. She made peace with all of it, or pretended to, which historically speaking is more or less the same thing. But what happens when the next First Lady isn't just gracious? She's magnetic when she dances in the parlor while Washington burns, when she becomes the very definition of charm and survival. Dolley Madison, James Madison, there are First Ladies who endured. And then there's Dolley Madison, the woman who performed the presidency better than the president himself. While James Madison quietly constructed the constitutional backbone of the United States, his wife was out front smiling, dancing, hosting, deflecting, remembering names, killing rumors, and occasionally evacuating burning buildings. She was the first First Lady to wield power as performance and to turn charm into a form of diplomacy. And like all good illusions, hers was constructed out of necessity, trauma, and perfectly calculated silk. The widow, the Quaker, the Queen. Dolley Payne was a Quaker widow with a baby on her hip when she met James Madison. He was 17 years older, barely 5 feet tall, chronically shy, and had all the charisma of a congressional ledger. Dolley, on the other hand, was electric, luminous, described by her enemies as suspiciously joyful. She had already buried a husband and 2 of her children from yellow fever before the age of 26. Grief turned her fashionable, not fragile. She married Madison in 1794, left the Quakers, they disowned her, and entered the Washington social circuit like a comet with a canapé tray. She understood something instinctively. In a country terrified of monarchy but starved for ritual, someone had to play queen. And Dolley, she brought the throne with her, the velvet grip. As First Lady, Dolley Madison turned White House functions into theater. She curated her appearance like political propaganda. Feathered turbans, blue velvet gowns, golden sashes, not for vanity, but to command attention in rooms where women were often treated like furniture. She hosted weekly drawing rooms, opened social events that blurred party lines, soothed rivalries, and created a rare space in early Washington where Federalists and Democratic Republicans could be civil, or at least pretend to be. She remembered everyone's name, gave eye contact like a dagger, laughed at the right jokes, gently corrected etiquette violations with a smile sharp enough to draw blood. She was politics in perfume, and she was very good at it, the fire in the frame. Then came the War of 1812. The British marched on Washington. Congress fled. James Madison, the commander-in-chief, galloped into the countryside to rally troops. And Dolley, she stayed. While the city panicked, Dolley held her post. She ordered the Presidential China Pact, saved state documents, and yes, she directed the rescue of Gilbert Stuart's famous portrait of George Washington, refusing to let it fall into British hands. Then she walked out of the White House just before the Redcoats set it on fire. History remembered her not as a victim, but as the last person who made the White House feel like something worth burning, the performance of power. Here's the paradox of Dolley Madison. She had no vote, no title beyond Mrs., no policy agenda, but she had presence, and in early America, presence was power. She made people feel heard. She made enemies eat together. She turned political wives into actors, not accessories. And yet, she was also a slaveholder, one of the few first ladies who sold enslaved people personally after her husband's death. She clung to the social order even as she played the progressive. She was beloved by the press, worshipped by guests, and quietly complicit in the same systems that made her grandeur possible. She wasn't above contradiction. She danced with it, and when she died, she was nearly broke. Congress had to buy her husband's papers just to keep her afloat. The woman who had once ruled D.C. with a smile and a punch bowl was buried with more reputation than riches. But then again, legacies don't need bank accounts, just good lighting. And what comes after the velvet and fire? What if the next First Lady came with fewer feathers, fewer smiles, and an aristocratic silence that made people uncomfortable? What happens when the crown sits heavier and she refuses to bow to anyone? Elizabeth Monroe, James Monroe, some First Lady's charm, some command. Elizabeth Monroe did neither. She was elegance in exile, a woman whose silence made more noise than her words ever did. And in a young republic desperately trying to figure out whether it wanted to be a democracy or a very elaborate costume party, Elizabeth chose a third path entirely. She became a queen without a crown, and America hated her for it. Elizabeth Courtwright was born in New York in 1768 into a wealthy Loyalist family. Translation, they were rich, English sympathetic, and extremely good at pretending to like everyone else. At 17, she married James Monroe, a future founding father and eventual fifth president of the United States. He was ambitious, measured, and charming in the way an oak tree is charming, solid, dependable, and slightly wooden. But when Monroe became U.S. Minister to France in the 1790s, Elizabeth became something else entirely. A diplomatic chameleon, she flourished in Paris. Elegant French fashion, effortless conversation, glittering soirée. She absorbed European decorum like a sponge dipped in champagne. The Parisians adored her. American observers were less sure. She looked like nobility, and that, to a country founded on smashing monarchies, was more dangerous than it sounded. Her most famous act came during this time. The rescue of Madame Lafayette from prison. The wife of the American Revolution's favorite Frenchman was imprisoned during the Reign of Terror. Monroe couldn't get her out, but Elizabeth, unarmed, unbidden, and unafraid, visited her in full view of the public. It sent a clear message. The United States had not forgotten its allies. It was a quiet act of diplomacy dressed as a social visit, and the next day, Lafayette was released. Not a word spoken on the record. No self-congratulation, just an immaculate gown, a controlled expression, and results. That was Elizabeth Monroe in one move. Graceful, steely, and 10 steps ahead of the room. When James Monroe became president in 1817, Elizabeth entered the White House like a phantom of Versailles. Gone were the noisy egalitarian gatherings of Dolley Madison. In their place, strict social schedules, rigid formality, minimal access. She refused to return social visits, a death blow in early 19th century society. She kept her circle small, her public appearances smaller, and the weekly receptions that had once unified a fractious capital, canceled. The press turned on her quickly. Descriptions of her ranged from regal to reclusive. Society wives whispered that she was cold, foreign, out of touch. They weren't wrong, but they weren't entirely right either. Elizabeth wasn't trying to be liked. She was trying to survive. Illness dogged her, migraines, possibly epilepsy, chronic fatigue, grief from the death of her son, political fatigue from the endless carousel of Washington egos. She built walls around herself, velvet walls, silent ones, and while everyone judged her for not being Dolley Madison, Elizabeth quietly judged them back and found them exhausting. No grand speeches, no beloved quotes, no motherly myths. Elizabeth Monroe left behind only rumors, fragments, and a first ladyship defined by absence. But what if that was the point? What if her silence was strategic, a refusal to be a mascot in a republic still unsure whether it wanted its women political, ornamental, or invisible? Elizabeth was none of those things, and a little of all of them. A living contradiction in imported lace. She didn't break the mold. She never acknowledged it existed. She believed in dignity over accessibility, ritual over sentiment, and if the public didn't understand her, she didn't lose sleep over it. Louisa Catherine Adams, John Quincy Adams. Louisa Catherine Adams was the only First Lady born on foreign soil, British by birth, French by education, American by accident, and never quite accepted by any of them. She was a poet in pearls, a diplomat in disguise, and a First Lady who spent most of her life proving she was American enough to belong in a country that kept reminding her she wasn't. Her story is one of the great ironies in the marble halls of power, a woman more refined, more articulate, and more psychologically complex than the men surrounding her, married to a man who couldn't even fake affection in public. Welcome to the House of Adams. Louisa was born in London in 1775 to an American father and a British mother, a duality she never outran. She spoke fluent French, played music like a concert pianist, and wrote with a pen so sharp it could slice through marble. She read philosophy for fun. She understood court politics before her debutante ball. And yet, to the Washington elite, she was always the outsider, the foreign one, the woman who talked too much like Voltaire and not enough like Plymouth Rock. Her marriage to John Quincy Adams, son of Abigail and John, began with love letters and ended in silent carriages. He was brilliant and cold, a man so politically ambitious he made his own father seem casual. He loved her, in theory, but mostly he tolerated her presence while building his career. She suffered miscarriages, endured long separations, and buried children while he chased diplomacy. She wrote poetry to keep from going mad. He wrote treaties. Guess whose word survived? During John Quincy's posting as U.S. Minister to Russia, Louisa lived in St. Petersburg. When he was called to Paris, he left without her. She traveled alone with her young son across 2,000 miles of war-torn Europe in a sleigh, through snow, through political collapse, through bandits, through entire languages she didn't speak. She arrived in France, frostbitten but alive. A living metaphor for what it meant to be married to John Quincy Adams. A journey through hell with a shrug, waiting at the finish line. She was elegant, brilliant, resilient, and invisible. When they returned to America, she found herself a stranger in a country she supposedly belonged to. Society women saw her as haughty. The men thought her too clever. She smiled anyway, practiced charm like piano scales. But beneath it all, she kept writing. Letters, diaries, satire, memoirs, even an unfinished novel where the protagonist dies of emotional neglect. Subtle. When John Quincy Adams became president in 1825, Louisa finally stepped into the role of First Lady. She hated it. She hated the politics, the pretense, the parlor performances. She resumed the drawing rooms out of obligation, not joy. And she kept the world at arm's length because that's where it had always kept her. And yet, she was beloved by some. Her intelligence shimmered beneath the surface. Her musical evenings were considered unmatched. She brokered friendships, gathered intel in social form, and likely knew more about what was really happening in D.C. than the men who wore the titles. She just never got to write the ending. When her husband lost re-election, she slipped from history's spotlight like a candle snuffed out in daylight. Her later years were filled with self-reflection, bitterness, and the slow vindication of watching her personal writings outlive the cold politics of her era. She once wrote, "I am the daughter of revolution, yet the wife of a cold republic." That about sums it up. Louisa Catherine Adams remains one of the most literate, cosmopolitan, psychologically rich first ladies in American history, and one of the most misunderstood. She was a woman asked to carry the contradictions of two nations, the baggage of two generations, and the weight of a marriage that demanded perfection in public and patience in private. And she did it all with a pen in her hand and frost in her lungs. She left behind no iconic portraits, no iconic quotes carved into monuments, just pages, letters, fragments of a life that proves first ladies aren't side characters. They're mirrors. Some crack, some reflect. Louisa did both. Emily Donelson, Andrew Jackson. Emily Donelson was the First Lady of the United States, except she wasn't. She was 21, married to the president's nephew. No political experience, no training, no vote, no voice, just a title she never asked for, and a family name that came with a curse, because the real First Lady, Rachel Jackson, was dead, and the reason she was dead was scandal. Rachel Donelson Jackson married Andrew Jackson, thinking her divorce from her first husband had gone through. It hadn't. When the error was discovered, the press tore her apart, calling her a bigamist, an adulteress, a woman of loose virtue. Jackson never forgave them. When he won the presidency in 1828, he blamed his wife's death, from a heart attack, on the public humiliation she endured. She died before he was inaugurated. He entered the White House grieving and already at war with Washington society. Enter Emily Donelson, Rachel's niece. Young, poised, loyal, and about to become the target of the nastiest scandal the early republic had ever seen. Emily Donelson took up the duties of First Lady with quiet dignity. She hosted receptions, managed correspondence, organized dinners, all while balancing the expectations of a capital that saw her as a child in a woman's gown. And for a while, she succeeded. Then came Margaret Peggy Eaton. The wife of Jackson's Secretary of War, Peggy was loud, flirtatious, confident, and allegedly had started her affair with John Eaton while still married to someone else. Washington society women, led by the devoutly proper Floyd Calhoun, wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun, refused to associate with her. Emily Donelson joined the silent boycott. Jackson exploded. To him, it was Rachel all over again. Another strong woman destroyed by slander. He demanded Peggy be accepted. The cabinet fractured. Friendships shattered. Marriages strained. The Eaton affair brought Washington to a standstill, all because of who a woman had or hadn't slept with. And Emily, the president's own niece, was suddenly on the wrong side of her uncle's rage. He cut her off from official duties, replaced her temporarily with another hostess. She returned eventually, but the damage was done. Her loyalty had been to social order, his to vengeance, and the White House was never the same again. Emily lived inside the political powder keg of the Jackson presidency. Every dinner party was a minefield, every reception a referendum. She watched as Jackson reshaped the executive branch with fire and fury. From the destruction of the Bank of the United States to the brutal Indian Removal Act, she kept smiling, hosting, managing, and quietly she fell ill. Tuberculosis crept in slowly, then ravaged her quickly. She died at just 29, a shadow of the elegant young hostess who once ruled the East Room with a fan and a fixed smile. She was buried with little fanfare. Her name faded from textbooks. The role she played was unacknowledged, unofficial, but indispensable. She kept the White House running when grief had hollowed it out, and she did it while being judged by the very people who refused to help. Emily Donelson's story is easy to overlook. No legislation bears her name. No statues stand in her honor. She wasn't First Lady by marriage, just by necessity. But that's what makes her story more unsettling. She became the feminine face of a presidency rooted in violence and vendetta. She played hostess to populist rage. She smiled through scandals she didn't cause. She mediated between a grief-mad president and a society determined to break women who didn't fit the mold. She was too proper for Jackson, too loyal for society, and too young to survive either. But when one stand-in falls, another is waiting. Another woman, another relative, another case of political grief forcing private lives into public theater. This time it wasn't a niece, it was a daughter-in-law. And the White House drama wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Sarah Yorke Jackson, Andrew Jackson. If Emily Donelson was the First Lady who tried to stand her ground, Sarah Yorke Jackson was the one who knew how to vanish while standing in plain sight. She was technically the First Lady, but technically the White House already had one. Dead, yes, but very much present. The memory of Rachel Jackson, the president's beloved and publicly disgraced wife, loomed so large that every woman who entered the executive mansion afterward had to make a choice: replace her or revere her. Sarah Yorke Jackson made the third choice. She disappeared into the role and kept the whole house from collapsing. Sarah Yorke was born into a wealthy Philadelphia merchant family. Her parents died young, raised by an aunt. Refined, educated, quiet, she was the kind of woman Andrew Jackson liked. Loyal, religious, and above all not interested in political drama. She married Andrew Jackson Jr., the adopted and deeply troubled son of the president, in 1831. Less than a year later, she moved into the White House. Technically, this made her the daughter-in-law of Andrew Jackson. Functionally, it made her the First Lady, sort of, because Emily Donelson, Jackson's niece, was still living there and still performing First Lady duties. And just like that, the White House had two First Ladies, one by tradition, one by marriage. Both women smiling across a room stretched taut with silence. There's no record of a public feud between Emily and Sarah, which is suspicious, because no house with two First Ladies, one furious president, and a dead matriarch in every painting could possibly stay that polite. But Sarah played it smart. She didn't try to outshine Emily. She didn't push for dominance. She managed the private quarters, oversaw domestic affairs, served as a moral support beam for a family creaking under the weight of politics, scandal, and grief. When Emily fell ill in 1836, the tuberculosis that would eventually kill her, Sarah stepped in fully. No fanfare, no power grab, just quiet continuity. She finished out Jackson's term as First Lady, standing beside a man still haunted by the public destruction of the woman he actually wanted there. A man who spoke of Rachel as if she'd just stepped out of the room, who wore her portrait like armor and carried her ghost into every cabinet meeting. Sarah never tried to compete with that. She just made sure the curtains were drawn, the tea was served, and the public never saw the cracks in the wall. Sarah Yorke Jackson might be the most invisible First Lady in American history, not because she did nothing, but because she did everything quietly. She didn't write memoirs, she didn't throw herself into public causes, she wasn't political, she wasn't loud, but she kept a home functional while the man running the country waged political war against banks, native nations, and half the federal government. She knew who the ghost in the room was, and she refused to haunt it back. After Jackson's presidency ended, Sarah returned to Tennessee with the extended Jackson clan, settling at the Hermitage, where she ran the household while the former president faded into ornery legend. She lived well into the 1880s, through the Civil War, through Reconstruction, through the reshaping of a nation her father-in-law had helped polarize, but she never stepped into the spotlight. She knew it didn't belong to her. Not in that house, not in that era. In a way, Sarah Yorke Jackson wrote a manual on what not to do if you wanted your name remembered. No speeches, no scandals, no signature projects, no bold quotes etched in granite. But maybe that's the real mystery. Because when the presidency itself is unstable, when the man in the Oval Office is furious, grieving, and explosive, maybe what the country needs isn't spectacle. Maybe it needs someone who doesn't make the center of power feel any more fragile than it already is. Sarah didn't want the spotlight. She wanted stability, and for a moment she gave it. But what happens when the next First Lady is neither ghost, nor hostess, nor stand-in, but a social force in her own right? What if she's not interested in fading into the background, but in redefining what it means to rule the room? Angelica Van Buren, Martin Van Buren. She was 20 years old. She wasn't the president's wife, and she didn't care. Angelica Van Buren wasn't just stepping into the role of First Lady, she was rebranding it. While America twisted itself into political knots over banking crises, slavery, and its own identity, Angelica was doing something far more delicate. She was making Washington society pretend it still believed in elegance. It was performance. It was politics. And for a while, it worked. Her father-in-law, Martin Van Buren, became president in 1837. He was widowed. His wife Hannah had died nearly 2 decades earlier. And unlike Jackson, he rarely spoke of her. So when it came time for someone to handle the ceremonial demands of the presidency, the receptions, the parties, the social smoothing over, Van Buren turned not to his own memory, but to his son's young wife. Angelica. She was striking, cultured, fluent in French, traveled, educated in the kind of way that made older men nervous and society women suspicious. She'd lived in England during her husband's diplomatic posting and had brought back with her more than souvenirs. She brought attitude, and America wasn't ready. Angelica didn't just host receptions, she curated them. She oversaw the redesign of White House interiors, adding flourishes inspired by European courts. She introduced a more formal, stylized tone to presidential events. Tighter guest lists, elaborate menus, fewer, raucous political mobs in muddy boots. She wore regal silks, delivered dazzling smiles, moved through the crowd like a woman who'd never been told no, because mostly she hadn't. And for a while it worked. The press marveled at her youth and beauty. Diplomats called her dazzling. Washington society finally had someone to fawn over again. She was referred to, semi-sarcastically, semi-accurately, as the American Queen. But monarchies don't sit well in republics, especially ones spiraling into economic depression. Behind the gold-fringed curtains, the country was unraveling. The Panic of 1837 wrecked the American economy within weeks of Van Buren taking office. Banks collapsed. Unemployment surged. Bread riots, bankruptcy, political chaos. And yet, inside the White House, the show went on. Angelica kept the doors open, the food exquisite, the chandeliers glittering, because to close them would have been to admit that the center could not hold. But not everyone bought the illusion. Critics accused the administration, and by extension Angelica, of being out of touch, elitist, performative. While ordinary Americans starved, the president's daughter-in-law was hosting soirees with imported wine and Parisian flair. It wasn't fair, but it was familiar. A beautiful woman, a political storm, and a nation looking for someone to blame. When Martin Van Buren lost his re-election bid in 1840, crushed by the populist fanfare of William Henry Harrison, Angelica vanished from Washington almost instantly. There were no farewell parades, no tributes, no lasting legacy. She faded into private life like a stage curtain dropping mid-act. Her later years were spent in quiet wealth, letters, children, silence. She never tried to reclaim the role. She didn't need to. For a brief, gilded window in time, she'd been the White House. Not its mind, not its soul, its surface, and sometimes that's enough. Angelica Van Buren is rarely remembered, which is ironic because no one in her era could stop talking about her. She was a placeholder for power that didn't know what to do with itself, the ceremonial face of an administration in free fall, a woman asked to host the nation's living room while the roof caved in and still make it look like a palace. She was not revolutionary. She was not political. She left no causes, no quotes, no initiatives. But what she did leave was a question. What happens when the role of First Lady becomes all costume, no compass? And speaking of costumes, the next First Lady never wore hers comfortably. She married into the role. She hid from it behind curtains and bone-deep grief. And her time in the White House ended before anyone could finish the guest list. Anna Harrison, William Henry Harrison, Anna Tuthill. Sims Harrison holds a unique and uniquely hollow distinction. She was First Lady of the United States for 30 days. Except she wasn't. She never set foot in the White House, never hosted a single event, never issued an invitation, gave a toast, or rearranged the parlor furniture. She was the First Lady in absentia, and her legacy is a portrait in negative space. An echo, a woman preparing for a job that would vanish before her train left the station. Anna Harrison was born in 1775, the same year the American Revolution broke out, to a politically connected family. Her father, a judge and a Revolutionary War officer, believed in education, intellect, and marrying strategically. Anna checked all three boxes. She met William Henry Harrison while staying with relatives. He was young, ambitious, and not rich, so naturally her father disapproved. She married him anyway. That decision bought her a life of almost permanent instability. William's military career kept him moving, from frontier forts to Indian battlefields to political posts in the Northwest Territory. Anna stayed behind, raising 10 children, managing farms, writing letters, bearing children, 6 of them in fact, and praying her husband would return in one piece, and hopefully not in scandal. She saw more death than ceremony, more silence than applause. and more Ohio winters than she ever asked for. When William Henry Harrison ran for president in 1840, it was a publicity stunt gone too far. He was 67, already the oldest man to run for president. The country mocked him as has-been, a relic, so his campaign turned that image on its head. Old Tippecanoe, war hero, log cabin, hard cider, a man of the people. The message worked. He won in a landslide. Anna didn't campaign. She barely commented. She wasn't excited about moving to Washington. "I wish that my husband's friends had left him where he is," she reportedly said. Translation: "Please don't make me First Lady." But she packed her trunks anyway, made plans, wrote letters, prepared to leave her home and step into the ceremonial cage that came with the White House. And then he died. William Henry Harrison gave the longest inaugural address in American history on a freezing March day without a coat or hat because image mattered more than pneumonia. He caught a cold. It turned into something worse. And on April 4th, 1841, just 31 days into his presidency, he died. The office passed to John Tyler. The nation went into mourning. And Anna? She never even left Ohio. She received news of her husband's death with the same tragic poise she had shown for years, the poise of a woman used to loss, used to managing grief from afar. She was sent a condolence letter by the government and a small pension. That was it. She never asked for more. She never stepped forward. She simply faded from the public eye again. Anna Harrison's life is defined not by what she did in the White House, but by what she almost did. She was educated, a rarity for women of her time. She read Latin, quoted scripture, knew history, had opinions, but she wasn't asked for those things. She was asked to wait, to raise sons who would die young, to support a husband who rarely stayed still, to pack for a journey that would end before it began. She outlived William by over 2 decades, lived through the Civil War, died at 88, the oldest woman to have almost been First Lady. Her grandson, Benjamin Harrison, would eventually become president. She never lived to see it, but maybe that's fitting. Her entire life was a prelude, never the chapter, always the parentheses. There's something poetic in the image, a room in the White House prepared for a woman who never arrived. Her name was etched into history, but lightly, without flourish. She was a placeholder, a promise, a near miss, and in a way, that makes her more haunting than all the feathered hostesses and scandal-dodging socialites combined. Because she reminds us of something simple, something terrible. You can do everything right, survive everything, and still miss the stage entirely. But in Harrison's absence, the role didn't vanish. It shifted. The White House still needed a hostess, still needed a woman to perform the public part of mourning and power. And so the title passed. Not to a wife, but to a daughter-in-law, Jane Irwin Harrison, William Henry Harrison. She was never supposed to be First Lady. She wasn't the president's wife. She wasn't even supposed to be in Washington that long. But history loves a substitution. So when William Henry Harrison died after just 31 days in office, the ceremonial burden of the White House, the receptions, the etiquette, the pageantry didn't disappear. It simply fell sideways and landed on Jane Irwin Harrison. Jane Irwin was born into privilege, educated, socially adept, married into the Harrison dynasty when she wed William Henry Harrison Jr., the president's son. He died in 1838, 3 years before his father won the presidency, leaving Jane a young widow with a child and a last name that suddenly carried national weight. In the winter of 1841, she traveled to Washington with her father-in-law, not to assume any grand title, but to assist him in the early days of his administration. He was old. She was sharp. The plan was simple. Help host a few parties, keep things moving, and return to Ohio when things settled. But things didn't settle. They collapsed. After the inaugural speech turned death sentence, after the coughing fits and fever, and after the quiet whisper of, "Sir, you're dying," the man Jane had come to assist became a ghost, and she inadvertently became First Lady. Technically, Jane Irwin Harrison was First Lady for just over 3 weeks, from the inauguration until her father-in-law's death. Functionally, she was the one receiving guests, handling arrangements, setting the tone of a White House barely moved into before becoming a mausoleum. While William Henry Harrison spoke about Rome in the rain, Jane was overseeing who sat where at dinner. While his illness worsened, she was the one making sure the grieving circus of Washington didn't spiral into full-blown chaos. There was no playbook, no title, no roadmap for what to do when a president dies and the body isn't even cold before the political scavengers start circling. But Jane knew how to keep the curtains closed, the silver polished, and the whispers manageable. It was a kind of power, temporary, invisible, but unmistakably real. Historians argue about whether Jane Irwin Harrison should be considered an official First Lady. She wasn't married to the president. She didn't live in the White House for long. She didn't establish initiatives or leave behind monogram china. But then again, what is a First Lady really? At that point in American history, the role had no salary, no legal definition, no formal expectations, just a vague cultural need to put a woman next to the seat of power, to assure the public that behind every statesman was a lady keeping the furniture and egos in place. Jane did that, briefly, beautifully, and without leaving fingerprints. After Harrison's death, John Tyler assumed the presidency. Jane packed her bags, returned to Ohio, raised her son, married again, disappeared from public life. There were no memoirs, no declarations, no late-in-life interviews with political magazines. She lived, she aged, she died, and history in its usual fashion skimmed right past her name, which is funny because while she was in the White House, she was admired, commented on, noted for her elegance and dignity in crisis. She left a mark that everyone saw, but no one preserved. It's almost poetic. She stepped in at a moment of national embarrassment, a dead president, a scrambled government, a capital unsure whether it could withstand its own reflection, and she made it look like everything was under control, just long enough to fool the guests. Jane Irwin Harrison doesn't have statues, doesn't have schools named after her, doesn't appear in textbooks unless there's a footnote war about technicalities. But maybe her story tells us something essential about the First Lady role, and the women who filled it before it was a brand, a campaign asset, a curated Instagram feed. Sometimes it was just grief in heels, responsibility with no title, dignity between funerals, and sometimes the best you could hope for was to get through the reception without the roof caving in. But the next First Lady didn't disappear into obscurity. She arrived in 2 stages, once as the silent sufferer, and again as the elegant second act. And when she returned, she brought everything Washington loved, and everything it refused to face. Letitia Tyler, John Tyler. Letitia, Christian Tyler, spent nearly her entire time as First Lady in a bedroom. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. She was the first First Lady to die in the White House, but before that, she was its most invisible occupant, a woman cloaked in chronic illness, propriety, and quiet resignation. The country barely knew she existed. Her husband didn't mind because John Tyler, the man who inherited the presidency by accident, was a man who preferred his power unshared and his wife unseen. John Tyler wasn't elected president. He was elected vice president under William Henry Harrison. Then Harrison died a month into office, and suddenly Tyler was in charge, a constitutional fluke the country didn't know how to handle. He moved into the White House, seized power, acted like it was all perfectly normal. Letitia, she didn't follow him to the public stage. She had suffered a stroke years earlier and was partially paralyzed. By the time John Tyler became president in 1841, Letitia had already retreated from Washington's brutal social demands. She arrived at the White House, but she didn't preside, didn't host, didn't dance, didn't give interviews. She sat upstairs in a wheelchair, read scripture, wrote letters, saw visitors only when absolutely necessary. A First Lady in title, not in action, and yet her influence lingered. Letitia Tyler was, by every surviving account, quiet, religious, reserved, loyal. She married John Tyler when she was 22, bore 8 children, and did what was expected of her. She kept the house running, the prayers coming, and the opinions to herself. But when she was no longer able to physically manage the household, she ceded those duties to her daughter-in-law, Priscilla Cooper Tyler, a woman far more visible, theatrical, and comfortable in the public gaze. Letitia never publicly objected, but she didn't vanish either. From her quarters upstairs, she continued to advise her husband in private. She remained emotionally close to her children. She read political commentary. She understood power and understood her place in it. Behind every authoritarian husband, there's often a woman with a prayer book and a clenched jaw. Letitia Tyler hosted exactly one public event as First Lady, the wedding of her daughter, Elizabeth. It took every ounce of strength she had. Guests noted her pale complexion, her deliberate movements, her effort to appear composed even while clearly suffering. It was a performance of presence, not because she wanted to be seen, but because someone had to do it. After that, she returned to her chambers. She remained there until September 10th, 1842, when she died of a second stroke, the First Lady to die in the White House. Her death was announced with somber dignity. The president was reportedly devastated. Flags were lowered, but no great national mourning followed, because most of the country barely knew who she was. Letitia's legacy is a blueprint written in absence. She was never scandalous, never outspoken, never politically visible, and in that she became a model, or perhaps a warning, of what the role could become when invisibility is mistaken for virtue. John Tyler would remarry within 2 years, and we'll get to her. But Letitia's story lingers, if only for how little of it survives. She wrote no memoirs, left behind no grand gestures. She was content, or trained, to live behind the curtain, and that's where history has kept her. But think about it. She entered the White House during a constitutional crisis, watched her husband become the most controversial figure in Washington, oversaw from a wheelchair the political fallout of a presidency no one wanted, and still managed to preserve her household's dignity while dying by degrees. She wasn't a partner in power. She was a shadow that kept the floor from collapsing. And in some ways, that takes more strength than speeches ever could. Priscilla Cooper Tyler, John Tyler, she wasn't the president's wife. She was his daughter-in-law. And yet, for a time, Priscilla Cooper Tyler was the beating heart of a White House still mourning one First Lady and not yet ready for the next. While Letitia Tyler withered quietly upstairs, and before Julia Tyler could sparkle her way in, it was Priscilla who kept the country entertained, kept the guests charmed, and kept the house from falling into permanent funeral mode. It wasn't a job she asked for, but she made it look effortless and a little theatrical, because it turns out Priscilla used to be an actress, and no one knows how to smile through discomfort like someone who's lived on stage. Priscilla was born in 1816 to a prominent theatrical family. Her father, Thomas Apthorpe Cooper, was one of the most famous actors of the early 19th century, known for playing Shakespearean kings and tragically doomed generals. She grew up backstage, learned to read an audience before she could spell, knew how to hold a room, and when she married Robert Tyler, the eldest son of John and Letitia, she joined a family that would need every ounce of her stagecraft, because by the time she reached the White House in 1841, Letitia Tyler, her mother-in-law, was too ill to perform any public duties. The social obligations of the First Lady had to fall to someone. Priscilla raised her hand, and so, at just 25, Priscilla Cooper Tyler became the acting First Lady of the United States. She didn't flinch, she didn't freeze. She took to the role like it was opening night at the National Theater. Her receptions were gracious but dignified. She revived the weekly levees, formal gatherings open to all citizens, which had been discontinued under the Tyler's frosty predecessor, Letitia. She decorated with taste, greeted guests with flair, and re-injected energy into a White House that had been stifled by illness and awkward transitions. Even critics admitted she was good at it. She was called graceful, intelligent, captivating. She could charm a visiting diplomat one moment and a bitter congressman the next. She wasn't just a stand-in, she was the main act, and people noticed. But beneath the satin and small talk, things weren't exactly stable. Her father-in-law, President John Tyler, was politically isolated, without a party, without congressional support, and frequently without tact. His vetoes infuriated both Whigs and Democrats. Washington was turning on him, and no amount of elegant dinner parties could wallpaper over a presidency caught in a slow-motion collapse. Then came the real blow, Letitia Tyler's death in 1842. Priscilla mourned, but she kept going. For 2 more years, she hosted as First Lady, even as the political winds blew colder and the budget for White House entertaining shrank. But change was coming. In 1844, President Tyler married Julia Gardiner, a woman 30 years his junior and far more interested in wielding social power directly. Julia was not here to share the spotlight. Priscilla stepped aside, quietly, gracefully, Without a scandal, without a quote, she returned to private life and vanished. Priscilla and Robert Tyler moved to Philadelphia, where Robert worked in government. During the Civil War, they sided with the Confederacy. Robert served as the Confederate Register of the Treasury. After the war, they settled in Alabama. She never sought public attention again, never wrote a memoir, never tried to reinsert herself into Washington lore, which is why most people forget she ever held the role at all. But for 3 crucial years, Priscilla Cooper Tyler was the face of the White House, a woman who knew how to act the part and when to leave the stage. Her performance wasn't loud, but it was perfect. Priscilla was an actress who learned the hardest lesson about public service. Sometimes the best performances are the ones no one claps for. She didn't change policy, she didn't defy the system, she didn't linger, but she held the room when no one else could, and she left just before the next woman turned the White House into a stage of her own. Julia Gardiner Tyler, John Tyler. You don't usually get a second first lady in a single presidency, but John Tyler wasn't exactly known for doing things by the book. So when his first wife, Letitia, died upstairs in silence, and the country barely noticed, Tyler decided to turn the volume all the way up. Enter Julia Gardiner Tyler. Wealthy, flirtatious, young enough to be his daughter, and about to make Washington society deeply uncomfortable in the most fashionable way possible. Julia Gardiner was born into old New York money and trained from birth in the arts of charm and conquest. She was intelligent, well-traveled, and bored of the men who courted her in drawing rooms. At age 24, she was already famous for posing, scandalously, in an advertisement for a department store draped in a Grecian gown and marketed as the Rose of Long Island. Society was aghast. Julia was not. She had no patience for false modesty. She liked attention, and when her family took her on a tour of Washington, she caught the eye of the recently widowed President John Tyler. He was 54. She was 24. Washington gasped. Julia smiled, and 6 months later, she was the First Lady of the United States. Julia Gardiner Tyler didn't step into the role. She sauntered. She brought European sensibilities, opera-trained drama, and a flair for showmanship that made even Dolley Madison look understated. Where Letitia Tyler had hidden behind curtains, Julia drew them open and added gold trim. She redesigned White House protocol, began using the title First Lady in formal announcements, required guests to bow, started having Marine Band performances at state dinners. She even signed her letters Mrs. President. This was less political hosting, more royal court, and she knew exactly what she was doing. America, still trying to figure out whether it wanted its leaders modest or mythic, didn't know what to make of her. The press called her vain. Society women rolled their eyes, and behind their fans they whispered, but they came to her parties anyway. Let's not forget, John Tyler was not a beloved figure. He had been thrown into the presidency by William Henry Harrison's death. He had no real party. He vetoed half his own coalition's bills. Congress referred to him as his accidency, but Julia didn't care. She adored him, called him my lion, played political cheerleader with unsettling enthusiasm. Her letters to friends glow with devotion and a touch of carefully curated image building. She lobbied hard for Texas annexation, campaigned socially for his legacy, hosted Southern politicians like royalty, and most controversially, aligned herself with slavery sympathizers in both tone and company. For all her sparkle, Julia Gardiner Tyler was no progressive. She called slavery a blessing and claimed enslaved people were happy and better off. She may have modernized the role of First Lady, but she anchored it to an image of wealth and order built on brutal hierarchies, and she never apologized for it. When John Tyler's presidency ended, Julia left the White House with fanfare and debt. The Tylers retired to Virginia, where they lived in diminished but defiant style. Tyler would die in 1862. A Confederate delegate, his loyalty to the Union severed. Julia, now a widow with 7 children, became the first former First Lady to receive a pension from Congress decades later. She died in 1889, still signing her name Mrs. Ex-President Tyler, still defending the Confederacy, still wearing her public identity like a crown she had never fully removed. History, depending on where you look, remembers her as either the First Lady who brought glamour to the role, or the one who mistook ceremonial power for a divine right. Both are probably true. Julia Gardiner Tyler was everything Letitia wasn't, Young, dazzling, controlling, theatrical, but beneath the gowns and invitations was a woman perfectly attuned to image, a prototype of the modern political spouse. She knew what the camera, or quill, needed, knew how to turn herself into a symbol, and like any good symbol, she was messy, dangerous, useful. She was the first lady who performed the presidency better than her husband ever could. And then, just as the glitter settled, came a woman who needed no performance at all. She was the opposite of glamour, the quiet wife of a quiet president, but still, she left a mark. Sarah Childress Polk, James K. Polk. Sarah Childress Polk was the first lady who didn't smile unless it meant something. She hosted no dances, served no alcohol, played no parlor games. And yet, she was one of the most politically powerful first ladies of the 19th century. Not because she sought influence, but because she was already fluent in it. Sarah didn't rule from the drawing room. She ruled from the margins, with precision, prayer, and just enough presence to keep her name out of the headlines and her husband's career in motion. Sarah was born in 1803 to Tennessee aristocracy, the kind of wealth that came with slaves, land, and tightly controlled reputations. She was educated at a level rare for women at the time, fluent in politics, literature, history, and the art of subtle persuasion. She met James K. Polk in her early 20s. He was ambitious, quiet, and painfully driven. She saw something in him, potential maybe, or raw material. Their marriage wasn't built on theatrics. It was built on strategy. They didn't have children by choice or by fate, no one knows. But what they had was alignment. She wasn't just his wife. She was his confidant, his sounding board, his editor, and occasionally, his gatekeeper. While James gave speeches, Sarah kept the guest lists. While James waged war with Congress, Sarah played long chess with public opinion. She understood power, but preferred it off stage. When the Polks moved into the White House in 1845, Sarah made it clear this would not be a party house. She banned dancing. She banned card games. She banned alcohol. The social calendar was sanitized to match her moral compass. Guests were expected to mind their manners and their volume. The Marine Band still played, but no one dared request a waltz. Behind her back, they called her the blue-stocking presidentess, and in front of her, they kept their mouths shut. Because Sarah had something rare in Washington: respect. Even political enemies of her husband acknowledged her intelligence, her command of detail, her eerie ability to anticipate pressure points. She read newspapers voraciously, edited James's speeches, organized his correspondence, sat in on strategy meetings, unofficially of course, and remembered everything. She never ran for office, she just managed the man who did. James K. Polk's presidency was defined by manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to expand from coast to coast. During his 4 years in office, he pledged not to run for a second term, and kept his word. The U.S. acquired the Oregon Territory, annexed Texas, and launched the Mexican-American War, gaining California, Arizona, New Mexico, and more. It was a time of brutal conquest, unrelenting ambition, and domestic control. Sarah supported it all. She believed expansion was divinely sanctioned. She defended slavery, and she helped her husband push through decisions that reshaped the continent. But she never shouted, never campaigned, never gave speeches. She just nodded, arranged things, whispered at the right moment, edited that one sentence out of the address, corrected the spelling of Monterey. She was political oxygen, invisible but vital. Polk left office in 1849, exhausted and likely dying. He was 53. He lived just 3 months after leaving Washington. Sarah, now a widow in her 40s, returned to Tennessee and entered deep mourning, dressed in black for the rest of her life, for 42 years. But she didn't disappear. She managed her husband's estate, guarded his legacy, corresponded with political figures, became a kind of First Lady Emerita, dispensing commentary and protection, like a matriarch of national memory. During the Civil War, she refused to take sides publicly. Even as her state, Tennessee, split in two, she died in 1891, still in black, still calling herself Mrs. James K. Polk, still refusing to waltz. Sarah Childress Polk may not be your favorite First Lady. She wasn't warm, wasn't fashionable, wasn't particularly fun, but she was brilliant. She proved that the First Lady didn't have to be a hostess or a showpiece. She could be a strategist, a gatekeeper, a moral compass, or, when needed, a scalpel. She wielded silence like a sword, faith like a firewall, and her husband's administration like a machine she'd spent years quietly assembling. And then came a woman who couldn't have cared less about machines. A general's wife, a front porch ghost, and perhaps the most reluctant first lady in American history. Margaret Taylor, Zachary Taylor. Margaret Taylor did not want to be first lady. Not a little. Not at all. Not ever. And for once, a first lady got exactly what she wanted. Sort of. Because while she physically occupied the White House, her spirit stayed behind, somewhere on the Kentucky frontier, where she'd once cooked over a fire and buried 2 daughters under the trees. She was one of the least visible first ladies in American history, and perhaps the most stubborn. But make no mistake, Margaret Taylor was not weak. She was a survivor. And she had zero time for White House nonsense. Margaret Peggy Mackle Smith was born in 1788 into a wealthy Maryland slaveholding family. She was refined, educated, and almost certainly expected to marry a gentleman of good breeding and predictable habits. Instead, she married Zachary Taylor, a rugged career military man who would spend 40 years marching through battlefields and frontier posts, and Peggy followed him. Always. She bore 6 children, buried 2 daughters to disease at a garrison in Louisiana, nursed wounded soldiers, cooked her own food, endured long stretches without furniture, privacy, or fresh milk. She wasn't a society belle. She was a military wife in the age of mud and mosquitoes, and she liked it that way. When Zachary Taylor was promoted to general during the Mexican-American War and suddenly became a national hero, Peggy was not impressed. When he was urged to run for president, she reportedly burst into tears because she knew what was coming. In 1849, Zachary Taylor took office as the 12th president of the United States. Margaret came with him reluctantly. She agreed to move into the White House on one condition. She would take no part in the ceremonial duties. She did not attend public events. She did not greet guests. She did not pose for portraits. She stayed upstairs, read her Bible, avoided the East Room like it was contagious. Instead, she deputized her daughter, Mary Elizabeth Betty Taylor Bliss, to act as White House hostess. Betty was young, bright, and socially graceful. She hosted receptions and handled the public role with charm, while Peggy remained a figure of whispered speculation. Washington gossiped. Was she ill, depressed, snobbish? None of the above. She simply refused. Margaret Taylor saw the presidency not as an opportunity, but a burden. And she wanted no part of the strange political theater that asked grieving, exhausted women to smile and pour punch. Her protest was quiet, but total. Zachary Taylor's presidency didn't last long. In July 1850, after just 16 months in office, he died suddenly, likely of gastroenteritis brought on by heat, bad water, and a stubborn refusal to rest. Rumors swirled of poisoning. None were proven. What mattered was that the man Margaret had followed across battlefields and through 1,000 nights of campfire grief was suddenly gone. She wept privately, refused attention, and quietly exited the White House almost as anonymously as she'd entered. The country hardly noticed. The newspapers focused on the political fallout, and Margaret, she returned to a quieter life, away from public view. She never remarried, never gave interviews, never commented on the experience. She died in 1852, just 2 years after leaving Washington. And with her passed a first ladyship defined by refusal. Margaret Taylor left no writings, no public legacy, no civic campaigns, no speeches or state dinners. Most of what we know about her comes secondhand, from staff, guests, and fragments of letters. And yet, her absence speaks louder than many first ladies' activism. She made it abundantly clear that no woman should be expected to perform femininity, grace, or charm just because her husband signed up for power. She didn't protest in words, she just said, "No, no, I will not be photographed. No, I will not entertain. No, I will not make your fragile republic feel more palatable," with a polite smile. It wasn't a revolution, it was a boundary, and it's still echoing. But after the silence of Peggy Taylor came something stranger. The next First Lady didn't just embrace public life. She was born into it, raised on politics, and ready to smile while Washington fell apart. Abigail Fillmore, Millard Fillmore. Abigail Fillmore was not born into power. She married into it, but she didn't perform it. She read it. She was the first lady to work her way out of poverty and obscurity and into the East Room of the White House. Not through inheritance, not through beauty, but through books, education, and stubborn intelligence. And when she finally reached the pinnacle of American society, she looked around and realized something strange. There were no books. So she ordered some. Born Abigail Powers in 1798, she was the daughter of a Baptist preacher who died while she was still a child. Her mother, refusing to let her children grow up illiterate, insisted on teaching Abigail at home. The family had very little money, but a decent collection of books. That was enough. Abigail read everything: novels, philosophy, law, theology. She grew up in upstate New York, poor but intellectually ravenous. She eventually became a school teacher, one of the few professions open to women that involved any level of authority. That's where she met Millard Fillmore, one of her students, briefly, though only by a few months in age. They shared books, they shared ideals, they married in 1826, and for the next 2 decades, she followed him up the political ladder, from small-time lawyer to congressman to vice president to president of the United States. And when they entered the White House in 1850, she brought something with her that no first lady before had fully embodied: a public intellect. Abigail Fillmore wasn't flashy. She wasn't beautiful in the traditional painted portrait sense, but she was respected, even admired, for her wit, her grace, and most importantly, her mind. She read the congressional record, debated policy with her husband, wrote letters dense with analysis, and more than anything, she believed the White House should be a place of learning, not just performance. So, when she moved in, she was stunned to discover that the executive mansion, the home of every American president to date, did not have a library. There were a few dusty books in a box somewhere, but no proper collection, no reading room, nothing befitting a head of state. Abigail decided to change that. She requested congressional funds, a rare act of assertiveness in a time when first ladies were supposed to ask for nothing, and used the money to create the first White House library. She personally selected the books, cataloged them, organized them by topic, and in doing so gave the White House a soul it had never officially possessed. While Abigail cultivated learning upstairs, her husband's presidency was, well, let's say, complicated. Millard Fillmore took office after the sudden death of Zachary Taylor and promptly found himself neck-deep in the boiling cauldron of the Compromise of 1850, a series of legislative measures meant to stave off civil war by appeasing both Northern abolitionists and Southern slaveholders. Spoiler, it didn't work. Fillmore's signing of the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed escaped enslaved people to be hunted down and returned to bondage even in free states, enraged abolitionists and permanently stained his political career. Abigail, though privately opposed to slavery, never publicly contradicted her husband. She supported him, hosted for him, listened to his critics in her parlor, and served them tea anyway. And while she avoided scandal, she could never quite escape the moral tension at the heart of that house. Liberty spoken downstairs, and compromise written into law. Abigail's health had never been perfect, and the strain of social duties weighed on her. She developed a persistent ankle injury that left her increasingly bedridden during the final months of the Fillmore presidency. When they left Washington in 1853, she looked forward to rest. Instead, she died 3 weeks later of pneumonia at age 55, after attending the inauguration of Franklin Pierce. She never got to see her library evolve. She never wrote her memoirs. She was, for the most part, quietly forgotten. But the books remained. Abigail Fillmore's legacy is not loud. She did not wear silk. She did not host balls. She did not scandalize or polarize or charm the press. But she built a library. She treated intellect as a virtue. She showed that a first lady could be a mind as well as a presence. She asked hard questions, sometimes only in private, and left the house smarter than she found it. And that might be the most radical act of all. But the next first lady wasn't interested in books. She had her own ghosts to manage. A woman who rarely spoke in public, but whose face would soon be on everything from postage to paranoia. Jane Pierce, Franklin Pierce. There are first ladies who embrace the spotlight. There are those who shunned it. And then there's Jane Means Appleton Pierce, a woman who treated public life not as an opportunity, but as a divine punishment. She didn't just dislike politics, she hated it. And when her husband won the presidency, she didn't move into the White House with excitement. She moved in like she was walking into a tomb, which in a way she was. Jane Pierce was the daughter of a devout, dignified New Hampshire family, quiet, frail, and deeply religious. She met Franklin Pierce, a charming, ambitious, hard-drinking politician, and married him against the quiet protest of her health and temperament. She disliked Washington, hated political climbing, hated social obligation, hated everything that came with ambition, but she loved her husband, and so she endured. They had 3 sons. All of them died. The final blow came just weeks before the inauguration in 1853. On a train bound for Washington, Jane and Franklin watched as their last remaining son, 11-year-old Benny, was killed in a derailment, his body crushed in front of them. Jane never recovered. Franklin barely pretended to. And then, the inauguration happened anyway. When Jane entered the White House, she was deep in mourning and determined to stay there. She refused to attend the inaugural ball. She refused to receive guests. She wore black. She wrote letters to her dead son. Literally, she believed Benny's death was a punishment from God for Franklin's political ambition, and she told him so. She prayed for his defeat, and when he won, she prayed harder for forgiveness. The nation got a president struggling to act sober, and a first lady who refused to be seen. For nearly 2 years, Jane Pierce vanished into the private residence of the White House. Curtains remained drawn, mirrors were veiled, receptions were canceled, social functions were bare. The executive mansion became a place of grief management, not governance. By 1855, Jane began making occasional appearances, not because she wanted to, but because people were starting to talk. She hosted modest dinners, attended small gatherings, but the mood never lifted. She never smiled for the press. She never gave the interviews. Her public persona was that of a ghost in black silk, always polite, always distant, never truly present. Behind the scenes, she supported Franklin in the only way she knew how, with letters, scripture, and whispered counsel. She encouraged peace, appeasement, a kind of quiet moralism, the exact opposite of what the country was sliding toward. Her husband's administration was collapsing under the weight of sectional division, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and his own political cowardice. The country was moving toward war, and Jane, she was just trying to make it to morning. When Franklin Pierce failed to win his party's nomination for re-election, the couple left Washington in 1857. Humiliated, haunted, and politically irrelevant, Jane never returned to public life. She never gave speeches. She never forgave the presidency for what it had taken. Franklin would die of cirrhosis in 1869. Jane would live another 6 years, alone in Massachusetts, surrounded by portraits of her dead family. She was never asked to give her side of the story, and she never offered it. Jane Pierce is often remembered as the shadow in the White House, a first lady who disappeared, a symbol of mourning, a cautionary tale. But maybe that's too easy. Maybe she was simply a woman broken by public life before she ever agreed to live it, a mother who had no more to give, a wife who paid a personal cost so high it bled through the drapes and into the wallpaper. She didn't change policy. She didn't write books. She didn't charm the nation. But she showed what happens when the White House isn't a home. It's a wound. And while Jane's story ends in silence, the next First Lady came with applause. She wasn't a widow. She wasn't mourning. She was the president's niece, and she'd been preparing her whole life to perform in the ballroom. Harriet Lane, James Buchanan. She wasn't a first lady by law. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't even supposed to matter. And yet, Harriet Lane became one of the most beloved and influential first ladies in American history, without ever marrying the president and without ever needing a ring to wield power. She was young, smart, impeccably dressed, and devastatingly aware of how public image works. While the country slid towards civil war, she hosted like she was taming a room of lions. And for a while, she did. James Buchanan, the only lifelong bachelor president, entered office in 1857 under a cloud of sectional tension and personal mystery. Rumors swirled about his relationship with his longtime housemate, William Rufus King. People whispered. No one confronted. The polite thing was to say nothing. but someone still needed to fill the social void of a missing first lady. Enter his orphan niece, Harriet Lane. She had been raised by Buchanan since her early teens, following the deaths of her parents. He sent her to elite schools, introduced her to diplomacy, and treated her not just as a daughter, but as a political asset. And Harriet understood the assignment. When he became president, she stepped into the White House and made it her own, with none of the hesitation, modesty, or mourning that had defined her predecessor. She wasn't just a hostess, she was a phenomenon. Washington society, bored, bitter, and deeply divided, needed a distraction. Harriet Lane delivered. She threw the best receptions in years. Not just elegant, but emotionally strategic. She knew which senators to seat near which ambassadors. She knew how to charm Southern slaveholders and Northern abolitionists in the same conversation without breaking a sweat. She redefined the role visually, bringing in new fashion trends from Europe, wearing daringly low necklines by 1850s standards, and adorning herself with jewelry that seemed both regal and relatable. The press loved her. Women copied her dresses. Men asked for her hand in marriage. Poems were written. Ships were named after her. She became the first lady to be treated like a celebrity. And in a country inching toward war, she made it feel, briefly, like unity was still possible over good wine and music. But the charm couldn't hold. As the nation fractured, Buchanan's presidency disintegrated. His refusal to stop Southern secession, his deference to pro-slavery forces, and his general passivity in the face of crisis made him one of the least effective presidents in U.S. history. Harriet didn't comment publicly, ever, but her private letters show flashes of insight. She hated the chaos, hated the betrayals, hated watching her uncle become a punchline in real time, and yet she kept hosting, kept smiling, kept lighting the chandeliers while the floorboards cracked. Her position didn't allow for rebellion. So she perfected control. Her final state dinners were reportedly tense, polite, and oddly cheerful, like the last dinner party on the Titanic. When Buchanan left office in 1861, Harriet didn't fight for legacy. She didn't write memoirs or attempt a comeback. Instead, she lived. She married late, at 36, to a wealthy Baltimore banker and had 2 sons. Both died in childhood. Her husband died soon after, and Harriet Lane, once the star of the White House, became a widow and motherless woman again. But she turned her grief into purpose. She became a philanthropist, dedicating her fortune to children's health, art, and education. She helped found the Harriet Lane Home for Invalid Children, now part of Johns Hopkins Hospital. She donated art to the Smithsonian. She left instructions that her legacy be one of service, not social glitter. She lived until 1903, long enough to watch the country she tried to unify with silverware survive. But barely. Harriet Lane didn't legislate, didn't protest, didn't shake up the system. What she did was master the room and then use the applause to build something lasting. She showed that even without marriage, without a title, without legal standing, a woman could define the tone of a presidency. She showed that politics didn't always look like speeches. Sometimes it looked like a seating chart, a glance, a perfectly timed compliment. She was the first lady who never married the president and still somehow stole the show. But after the parties ended, the war began, and the next first lady, she was already grieving before she moved in. And once she was there, she watched everything, including her sanity, fall apart. Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln. She was not universally loved. She was not gentle. She was not quiet. She was Mary Todd Lincoln. And she didn't come to the White House to smile and nod. She came dragging generations of trauma, ambition, and defiance. And once inside, she proceeded to explode every soft expectation of what a first lady was supposed to be. Mary didn't fit the mold. She set it on fire, and then history blamed her for the smoke. Mary was born in 1818 into Kentucky aristocracy, a slave-holding family of Southern loyalty and political might. But unlike most women of her class, she was formally educated, fluent in French, fiercely opinionated, and interested in politics. She met Abraham Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois, a tall, awkward lawyer with terrible suits and a brain that moved like lightning under thunderclouds. They married in 1842. It was a bond built on sharpness and shadows. She supported his ambitions, fed his intellect, bore 4 sons, and buried 3 of them. By the time she became First Lady in 1861, She had already lost a child, fought family members over slavery, and endured years of political ridicule. And then the Civil War began, and Mary found herself in a house split by ghosts. Mary Todd Lincoln's White House was under siege, literally and socially. She was a Southern woman married to a president at war with the South. Half her family fought for the Confederacy. She was accused of being a spy, a traitor, a mad woman, a puppet master. The North distrusted her. The South disowned her. She retaliated with elegance and rage. She spent lavishly on White House renovations, chandeliers, drapes, imported wallpaper. During wartime, while soldiers bled to death in tents, she hosted formal dinners with musicians while the Union Army starved in Virginia mud. Was it out of vanity, desperation, or an unspoken attempt to hold the world together with fabric and candles? Even now, no one agrees. But the cost was high. Politically and personally, Congress launched an investigation into her spending. The public branded her Madame Extravagance. Her defenders were few, her enemies relentless, and still she stood by her husband, fiercely, publicly, and sometimes violently. When someone called Lincoln an ape at a public event, Mary snapped, "If you call my husband an ape again, I'll scratch your eyes out." That's one way to do diplomacy. Mary's grip on reality was fraying long before April 14th, 1865, but that was the night it snapped. She was in the box at Ford's Theater. She was holding his hand when the shot rang out. She was there when Abraham Lincoln died, and something inside her died too. What followed was a descent, not a fall, a slow, anguished spiral into grief, paranoia, and public humiliation. She wore black for the rest of her life, traveled Europe to escape gossip, obsessed over seances and spiritualists, and became one of the first victims of American tabloid culture. Her surviving son, Robert Todd Lincoln, cold, proper, politically minded, eventually had her committed to an insane asylum in 1875. She never forgave him. She was released after a year, spent the rest of her life in near total isolation, died in 1882, alone in a hotel room, her mind and legacy in tatters. Mary Todd Lincoln remains one of the most controversial first ladies in American history. Some see her as unstable, others as brilliant but broken, still others as a woman crushed by grief in a country that demanded its women grieve quietly. She was not quiet. She wailed. She seethed. She bought too many dresses and cried in too many mirrors. She mothered too hard and mourned too loud. She stood at the very center of American history and was never truly allowed to belong to it. Her tragedy wasn't that she broke, it's that we expected her not to. And after the war, after the mourning, after the blood was cleaned from the carpet, came a first lady who brought back stillness, stability, and a southern accent laced with quiet fire. Eliza McCardle Johnson. Andrew Johnson. She was barely seen, almost never heard. And in many ways, Eliza McCardle Johnson was the first lady who existed only in footnotes. But make no mistake, she mattered, because behind the president who tried to glue the country back together with spit and Southern stubbornness stood a woman who had been carrying broken things her entire life. She wasn't interested in power. She was interested in surviving it, and survive it she did, with a Bible, a cup of tea, and the endurance of someone who knew that sometimes the best way to lead is to stay upstairs. Eliza McCardle was born in Tennessee in 1810, the daughter of a shoemaker. At age 16, she met Andrew Johnson, a poor, self-educated tailor's apprentice who couldn't yet spell president, let alone imagine himself as one. They married quickly. He was ambitious. She was sharp. She read books out loud to him while he worked. She helped him improve his writing, his speech, his confidence. She believed in him before anyone else did, she wasn't political, but she was practical. The kind of woman who knew when to patch a coat, when to hold her tongue, and when to move the family fast because the neighbors were talking. When the Civil War came, she stayed in Tennessee, quietly unionist, quietly unbending. Her loyalty to the cause never made headlines, but neither did her grief. She buried 2 of her children before she ever saw Washington. When Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency in 1865, after Lincoln's assassination, in the raw, open wound of a country not yet done bleeding, Eliza Johnson became First Lady by default. She hated it. Her health was already failing. Tuberculosis, or something close to it, left her weak, fatigued, and deeply withdrawn. She barely left her room. Her only consistent social act was hosting tea for small family groups. often with her daughter Martha, who took on most of the formal duties. She avoided public receptions, didn't sit for official portraits. She existed behind closed doors, known more through rumors than records. One story goes that when reporters tried to speak with her, she said simply, "I take no part in the ceremonies of the White House." And she meant it. Andrew Johnson was no one's idea of a consensus builder. He was brash, bigoted, and often belligerent, a Southern Democrat governing a Northern victory, trying to lead a country that wanted him gone before he started talking. He was impeached in 1868, the first U.S. president to face it. The House charged him with violating the Tenure of Office Act, among other things. The Senate trial was public, vicious, and humiliating. Eliza stayed upstairs. She didn't offer commentary, didn't call for sympathy, didn't attend the trial. She prayed, and she endured. When her husband survived the impeachment by a single vote, she didn't celebrate publicly. She just kept moving, as if she'd known all along how close the blade had come. After the presidency, Eliza returned with Andrew to Tennessee, quietly, stoically, and still unwell. She would die just 6 months after her husband, in 1876. She left behind no writings, no formal legacy, no dramatic scenes. But if you peel back the layers of her silence, a pattern emerges. She helped her illiterate husband become a senator, governor, and president. She raised 5 children in war, poverty, and political scandal. She survived the Civil War from the wrong side of the Mason-Dixon line, and she endured the White House not as a palace, but as a prison with better curtains. Eliza McCardle Johnson isn't in the textbooks. There are no statues, no schools bear her name, but she is proof that sometimes the First Lady isn't the symbol of power. She's the witness to it. She didn't host, she didn't entertain, she didn't try to change the narrative. She just outlasted it, and sometimes, in a country obsessed with noise, endurance is the most radical act of all. And when the smoke of war finally cleared, the country was ready for a new image. Something softer, smiling, a war hero in the White House, and a First Lady who knew how to turn loss into legacy. Julia Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, Julia Dent. Grant did not blend in. She didn't vanish. She didn't resist the role of First Lady. She embraced it, possessed it, expanded it. She wasn't tragic. She wasn't fragile. She was thrilled to be there. She believed in her husband long before the country did, and long after it stopped believing in itself. And while Ulysses S. Grant was busy trying to keep Reconstruction from falling apart, Julia was managing the mood. One chandelier, one guest list, and one unforgettable smile at a time. Julia Dent was born in 1826 into a slaveholding family near St. Louis, Missouri. Her childhood was all Southern charm and mild aristocracy. Plantation dinners, piano lessons, riverfront sunsets. She was educated at an elite finishing school and taught that a woman's power came from gentleness, obedience, and marital strategy. She learned selectively. She met Ulysses Grant, then a young West Point cadet, when he visited her brother. He was quiet, unremarkable, a little awkward, but she saw something. They fell in love. He proposed. Her family objected, politely with money, and she married him anyway, and then spent the next decade following him from one army post to another, often poor, often alone, but always certain that he was going to matter. And when he did, when he rose from failed clerk to victorious general to president of the United States, Julia was ready. She'd been rehearsing this role for years. Julia Grant moved into the White House in 1869 with a mission. She wanted to make it beautiful, sociable, prestigious, American royalty, but with better desserts. And she succeeded. She revived lavish receptions, hosted daily open house-style levees, restyled the decor, filled the rooms with fresh flowers and fresh gossip. She wore extravagant dresses, often designed in New York or Paris, and posed proudly, despite the fact that she had a pronounced strabismus, a crossed eye, which she refused to have surgically corrected. She said it made her unique, and she was right. Unlike many first ladies before her, Julia wasn't content with shadow influence. She relished the public gaze. She saw the First Lady role not as an afterthought, but as an institution. Her correspondence shows a woman with opinions on politics, people, appointments, and how often the china should be reordered. She didn't make policy, but she made the vibe. And during the shaky years of Reconstruction, That mattered. Ulysses S. Grant was a brilliant general. As president, let's just say, not as much. His administration was racked with corruption scandals, cronyism, fraud, embezzlement. Grant himself wasn't implicated directly, but the people he trusted, they looted the federal government like it was a game show. Through it all, Julia stood by him, smiling, hosting, spinning. She played the role of innocent wife to a T. But behind closed doors, she was angry. Angry that people were betraying her husband. Angry that the press was cruel. Angry that the presidency she had dreamed of was being tarnished by bad headlines and worse allies. But she never let it show. Not in public. She kept the candles lit, the ballrooms full, the narrative intact as best she could. Because for Julia, power was theater. And the First Lady's job was to make sure the curtain never dropped. When Grant left office in 1877, Julia wasn't ready. She wanted more. More spotlight, more legacy, more time. So, when talk of a third term for Grant began to circle, it wasn't just political ambition, it was her dream too. It didn't happen, but the idea had been planted. Julia Grant became the First Lady to write a memoir, though it wasn't published in her lifetime. She traveled, entertained, advised. She died in 1902, buried next to her husband in New York. Her wish was simple, to remain near him forever. But her legacy? Not simple at all. Julia Grant was joyfully political, strategically feminine, unapologetically visible. She didn't shrink from scrutiny. She used it. She didn't hide from attention. She invited it. And she made it clear that being First Lady wasn't a burden. It was a privilege, a platform, and a performance worth dressing up for. She smiled through scandal, laughed through war, and made the White House feel for a moment like it could heal itself with light and music and just enough illusion. But after the music faded, the country wanted quiet, someone simpler, smaller. The next First Lady didn't sparkle. She steadied, and she watched her husband lose the White House and his mind. Shall we continue with Lucy Webb Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes? Lucy Webb Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes. Lucy Webb Hayes was the First Lady who brought decency back and took alcohol out. She was the First Lady with a college degree, the first to be called First Lady as a common title, and the first to prove that you didn't need scandal or sparkle to change the mood of a nation. You just needed conviction, charm, and a pitcher of lemonade. They called her Lemonade Lucy. She didn't mind. She had better things to do than argue with people about booze. Born in Ohio in 1831, Lucy was raised by a widowed mother and a household steeped in abolitionism, education, and Methodist values. Her family believed in clean living, clear thinking, and full equality. Long before it was fashionable or politically convenient, she attended Wesleyan Female College, where she studied rhetoric, literature, and philosophy. She could quote Cicero, she could quote Christ, and she could win any argument without ever raising her voice. She met Rutherford B. Hayes while still a student, a quiet, thoughtful lawyer with a Union future and political ambition. They married in 1852, and from the beginning, she wasn't just his wife, but his intellectual equal, and eventually his compass. She supported abolition. She visited the wounded during the Civil War. She advocated for veterans, freed slaves, the poor, the mentally ill, and she did it all with a smile soft enough to get past the front door, and a spine strong enough to change what happened inside it. Rutherford B. Hayes entered the White House in 1877 after one of the most controversial elections in U.S. history, the Compromise of 1877, which ended Reconstruction and arguably sold out the rights of Southern Black Americans in exchange for peace. It was a bitter victory, a tense time, and Lucy didn't flinch. She hosted receptions immediately, opened the doors to all citizens, including Black Americans, at a time when most of the country was retreating from the promises of equality. She brought music, laughter, and a refreshing lack of pretense to the executive mansion. But she also brought sobriety. She banned alcohol at official events. The press dubbed her Lemonade Lucy, not entirely fairly, as the alcohol ban was her husband's decision, and she merely supported it. But the nickname stuck, and she wore it like a badge. Not because she hated fun, but because she believed in self-control, clarity, and public virtue, qualities she felt the country sorely lacked after the Gilded Age's excess. Besides, she had other priorities. Lucy Webb Hayes was the quiet engine behind a presidency struggling to restore faith in government. She supported civil service reform, education for women, temperance, and racial equality, all without issuing a single formal policy. She didn't write legislation. She wrote invitations to former slaves, to union widows, to children's choirs and war amputees. She believed the White House should reflect the best of the nation, not just the wealthiest, and people noticed. Visitors described her as serene, earnest, intensely kind. She didn't dazzle like Julia Grant. She didn't charm like Dolley Madison, but she comforted. And in post-Reconstruction America, that was revolutionary. She even hosted the first Easter egg roll on the White House lawn, a tradition that continues to this day. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, she remained her husband's most trusted advisor. She read his speeches, edited his letters, encouraged his moderation, softened his edges. He called her his conscience, and he meant it. When the Hayes administration ended in 1881, Lucy left Washington quietly, without fanfare, returning to Ohio with her husband and fading from public life on purpose. She spent her later years working on education reform, championing temperance, and helping establish women's scholarships. She died in 1889, surrounded by her family and mourned by a nation that didn't realize until later how much she had shaped its values. Not through force, but through example. Lucy Webb Hayes didn't scandalize, didn't seduce, didn't sparkle in diamonds. She led through warmth, clarity, and a kind of stubborn moral optimism that feels almost radical now. She believed the First Lady could be a public servant, not a party hostess. She believed in public virtue at a time when public virtue was out of style. She believed you didn't need a glass of wine to make people feel welcome, just a voice, a purpose, and a pitcher of lemonade. But next comes a woman who didn't just welcome you in, she lit the whole room with her smile. She laughed when others flinched. She loved her husband fiercely, and her time in the White House would be the shortest and the bloodiest. Lucretia Garfield, James A. Garfield, Lucretia Crete. Garfield did not campaign. She did not seek the spotlight. She did not plan on being a first lady, and she certainly didn't plan on becoming the keeper of America's grief. But when fate or bullets forced her into history, she didn't blink. She just stayed. And sometimes that's the bravest thing anyone can do. Born in Ohio in 1832, Lucretia Rudolph was a preacher's daughter with a classical education and a mind built for structure. She read Latin, taught school, wrote dry, elegant letters, and at age 26, she married a man named James A. Garfield, a teacher, soldier, and future congressman with more charisma than discipline. Their early marriage was rocky. Garfield was ambitious and emotionally erratic. Lucretia was reserved, independent, and allergic to nonsense. He wrote love letters to other women. She responded with cold distance. They nearly drifted apart. But then something shifted. Maybe it was age, or war, or loss, or simply the slow burn of two people figuring out they couldn't do better than each other. They came back together. And by the time Garfield was elected president in 1880, Lucretia was not just his wife. She was his still point. She entered the White House in March of 1881, quiet, modest, almost Victorian in her refusal to self-promote. She avoided grand receptions, hosted intimate dinners, and began renovating the dilapidated residence with quiet precision. She was a deep thinker, interested in history, art, architecture, philosophy. She read constantly, journaled obsessively, and planned to make the White House into a home of culture and reflection, not just politics and ego. But she barely had time to unpack the silverware. 3 months into her husband's term, Lucretia fell seriously ill with malaria and left Washington to recuperate in New Jersey. While she was gone, he was shot. On July 2nd, 1881, President James A. Garfield was shot by a disgruntled office seeker in a Washington train station. The bullet lodged behind his pancreas, and in an era before proper antiseptic surgery, doctors did more damage than the assassin. Lucretia rushed back to Washington. She found a house in crisis, a husband hovering between life and death, and a country watching her face for signs of hope, and she delivered. For 80 days, Lucretia Garfield became America's caregiver. She stayed by his bedside, praying, managing his medical team, writing letters, reading aloud, and trying not to fall apart as the man she loved turned yellow with infection. The public watched her every move. When she appeared at a window, crowds cheered. When she walked down the hallway, even cabinet officials stepped aside. Newspapers called her Saint Lucretia. Telegrams flooded the White House with messages of sympathy and awe. She never broke. Not in public, not while it mattered. She remained dignified, precise, composed, as if her stillness might keep him breathing. But it didn't. On September 19th, 1881, President Garfield died, and Lucretia Garfield, widow at 49, walked back down the same hallway, this time completely alone. She left the White House quietly. No farewell, no interviews, just grief, and a box of letters no one was allowed to read. But Lucretia didn't disappear. She spent the rest of her life preserving her husband's legacy. She meticulously curated his papers, letters, speeches, eventually establishing the first presidential library, long before it was a federal tradition. She raised their children, oversaw Garfield's estate, and kept journalists, historians, and politicians at arm's length for the rest of her life. She lived another 36 years. She never remarried. She never sought attention, but she outlived almost everyone who doubted her strength. Lucretia Garfield never asked to be First Lady. She didn't want the job, but when history shoved her into it, she held the center. And when the center collapsed, she kept standing. She represents something rare. A woman who loved privately, lost publicly, and managed both with discipline instead of drama. She didn't dazzle. She didn't charm. She just endured and quietly helped invent what we now call grace under pressure. Mary Arthur McElroy, Chester A. Arthur. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a widow. She was a sister. And for 4 quiet, carefully managed years, Mary Arthur McElroy held the role of First Lady not by title, not by ambition, but by invitation. Her brother, President Chester A. Arthur, had entered the White House already in mourning. His wife, Ellen Arthur, had died just 18 months before he assumed office. He never recovered. So when the dinners needed planning, the guest lists arranging, the national optics managed, he turned to the only woman he trusted with his grief, Mary. She didn't want fame. She didn't need legacy. She just knew how to keep the house in order, while her brother tried to hold the country together. Mary Arthur McElroy was born in 1841 in upstate New York, the youngest of 9 siblings in a Scotch-Irish household that valued education, formality, and decorum above all. She married an Albany businessman, William McElroy, had children, lived a relatively quiet domestic life, and never imagined herself as a national figure. But when Chester became president in 1881, after James Garfield's assassination, Mary received a letter. He needed her, not as a guest, not as a sister, but as the woman who would represent the presidency to a nation still traumatized by loss. And she said yes. Mary moved into the White House only during the winter social season, when receptions, dinners, and public appearances were required. The rest of the year she stayed in Albany, tending to her home and children, a rare balancing act even now. She hosted more than 30 receptions, including 2 large state dinners and a formal celebration for Queen Victoria's birthday. But she never pretended to be the president's wife. She didn't redecorate, didn't insert herself into politics, didn't chase the attention her position made possible. She wore black, in sympathy for her sister-in-law, Ellen Arthur, whose portrait she insisted be hung in the White House during events. Mary didn't replace Ellen. She preserved her memory. Even her staff described her presence as respectful, unobtrusive, precise, which might be another way of saying she was never a problem. And in a house still haunted by ghosts, that mattered. Chester A. Arthur never remarried. He kept Ellen's room untouched. He wrote poetry to her long after she was gone. He had a stained glass window installed in St. John's Episcopal Church in her memory, while avoiding any public declarations of grief. So Mary did what Ellen no longer could. She smiled for cameras, greeted the diplomats, wore the lace, arranged the seating, and, most importantly, she understood the assignment: maintain the dignity of the White House, without pretending to replace the woman who should have been there. It was a balancing act so subtle no one noticed, which meant she got it exactly right. When Arthur declined to run for re-election in 1884, Mary packed up and returned to Albany without fanfare. No memoirs, no farewell interviews, no legacy tour. She resumed her role as wife, mother, and respected local hostess. Her name never trended in papers. Her speeches were never quoted. Her dresses were never dissected in magazines. And that was exactly how she wanted it. She died in 1917, having watched the White House evolve through war, progress, and scandal, and never once tried to re-enter it. Mary Arthur McElroy was a first lady in everything but name. She modernized nothing. She radicalized nothing. She didn't fight. She didn't flee. She just filled a void with warmth, wit, and a total refusal to outshine the woman who should have been there. And sometimes that's the purest form of public service. She was the footnote who held the room together, the placeholder who made sure history didn't fall apart while grief was still settling in. No slogans, no scandals, just a sister with a clipboard and a legacy of quiet grace. You're absolutely right again. Another sharp catch. Before Frances Folsom Cleveland dazzled Washington as the youngest First Lady in American history, it was Rose Elizabeth Cleveland, Grover Cleveland's older sister, who filled the role of First Lady during the first 14 months of his first term. And unlike many placeholders, Rose left behind something more than etiquette. She left a paper trail of wit, intellect, and one of the most fascinating private lives in White House history. Rose Cleveland, Grover Cleveland, she was never supposed to be famous, and she never wanted to be. But when Grover Cleveland, bachelor, and bachelor again, stepped into the White House in 1885, someone needed to play First Lady. He turned to his sister, Rose Elizabeth Cleveland, a scholar, a lecturer, a woman more interested in Greek poetry than parlor games. She said yes, but she didn't say it lightly, because Rose Cleveland wasn't just stepping into the role of national hostess. She was stepping into a performance she never believed in, and for 14 months she played the part with an arched brow and a loaded vocabulary. Rose Cleveland was born in 1846, the youngest of 9 children in a politically devout family. Her father died when she was young, and her mother, pragmatic and pious, raised her to value intellect, restraint, and moral rigor. Rose complied, almost too well. By the time she was in her 30s, she was already a published essayist, a lecturer on classical philosophy, and an unapologetic academic in an era when women were still being told to smile more. So, when her brother was elected president as a lifelong bachelor, she agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to serve as his first lady. But she made one thing clear. She wasn't going to pretend to be something she wasn't. Rose hosted state dinners. She stood in reception lines. She wore the required dresses, but she rarely enjoyed herself. She found most Washington social events painfully dull. She preferred reading to small talk, publishing essays to planning menus. Guests found her polite but reserved. Critics found her too serious, too brainy, too cold. They weren't wrong, but they weren't entirely right either, because Rose Cleveland brought something to the White House that hadn't really been seen before: publicly intellectual femininity. She wrote essays while acting as First Lady, engaged with literary societies, corresponded with thinkers, not debutantes. She gave interviews where she quoted Dante. She was known to correct the grammar of visiting diplomats. She was less First Lady, more reluctant philosopher in residence. And when newspapers complained that she didn't smile enough, she didn't bother replying. She had other things to do. Then, in 1886, everything changed. Grover Cleveland, aged 49, married Frances Folsom, aged 21, the daughter of his former law partner and a woman he'd known since she was a child. It was, to put it mildly, a national spectacle. Frances became a press darling instantly. She was beautiful, cheerful, fashion-forward, everything Rose had refused to pretend to be. Rose graciously stepped aside, packed her books, and left Washington. No drama, no bitterness, just relief and silence, until the letters surfaced. In the decades after her exit, Rose Cleveland became known less for her White House stint and more for her private life, specifically her long, romantic, deeply intimate relationship with Evangeline Simpson Whipple, a wealthy widow and philanthropist. The two women exchanged passionate letters for years, documents full of affection, longing, and intellectual intensity, the kind of writing that rarely survives the 19th century's firewalls of respectability. After years apart, they reunited in Europe in their later lives and lived together until Rose's death in 1918 during the Spanish flu pandemic. Their letters were suppressed, then discovered, then studied. And today, Rose Cleveland is remembered not just as a footnote, but as one of the earliest, most well-documented examples of queer love in First Lady history. She didn't marry, she didn't soften, she didn't convert her intellect into politics. She lived on her own terms, even when the country she briefly represented refused to see her clearly. Rose Cleveland was a First Lady in the wrong time, too smart for the parlor, too reserved for the press, too radical for the front page. She didn't sparkle, she didn't flirt, she didn't soothe the nation, but she wrote, she survived, she loved, and she made the First Ladyship, even for just over a year, something sharper, stranger, and more intellectually dangerous than it had ever been. And then came the fairy tale. The real First Lady, the Princess Bride America had been waiting for. She was half Rose's age, twice as photographed, and ironically, just as clever. Frances Cleveland, Grover Cleveland, she was young, she was beautiful, and she was married to the President of the United States. Frances Folsom Cleveland wasn't just the First Lady. She was the first First Lady to be a fashion icon, a press obsession, and a cultural phenomenon in her own lifetime. She was 21 when she married 49-year-old Grover Cleveland, the only president to ever wed in the White House. And from the moment she appeared on the national stage, she was no longer a person. She was an event. Frances Folsom was born in 1864. Her father, Oscar Folsom, was a law partner and close friend of Grover Cleveland. After her father's untimely death, Cleveland became Frances's legal guardian, managing her finances, overseeing her education, and maintaining a quiet, avuncular presence in her life until she turned 21, and he proposed. The press didn't know what to do with that. Some called it romantic. Others called it grotesque. Many just printed headlines. But Frances, elegant, poised, and strangely in control, said yes. And on June 2nd, 1886, she walked down the aisle in the White House Blue Room, the first and only bride to do so. Suddenly, America had a queen. And the White House had a resident it could turn into gossip, fashion tips, and public obsession. Frances Cleveland redefined the First Lady's public image, and she did it on purpose. She was everywhere, pictured in newspapers, described in obsessive detail, sketched, gossiped about, followed on shopping trips. Her gowns from New York, Paris, custom fit and perfectly dramatic, became national talking points. So did her hairstyles, her gloves, even her posture. But she wasn't just decorative. She was good at this. She walked into a room like she owned it, smiled at strangers like she had known them for years. She radiated the one thing Washington almost never sees, authentic charm. She hosted receptions like they were art installations. She remembered names. She touched elbows and rewrote etiquette. She even broke one of the oldest traditions by personally shaking hands with visitors, something previously done only by the president. The public adored her, and she knew how to wield that love like a velvet hammer. Not everyone was charmed. Some moral crusaders clutched their pearls over her sleeveless gowns and her apparent influence on young women. There were petitions demanding she set a better example for modesty. Frances ignored them. She understood something most First Ladies before her hadn't. The public wants to see its First Lady, to project, to idolize, to critique. She wasn't a blank canvas. She was a mirror. And if you didn't like the reflection, that was your problem. She also knew how to wield her image politically. In 1888, when Grover Cleveland ran for re-election and lost to Benjamin Harrison, Frances told the White House staff, "Take good care of the house. We'll be back in 4 years." And she was right. Cleveland returned to office in 1893, the only president to serve non-consecutive terms, and Frances came back with even more popularity, more poise, and 2 children born in the interim. By then, she wasn't just First Lady. She was American royalty. When the second Cleveland presidency ended in 1897, Frances finally stepped out of the spotlight, but never quite faded. She moved to Princeton, raised her children, became involved in women's education and civic life, and lived until 1947, surviving her husband by nearly 40 years and witnessing 2 world wars and 13 more presidents. She remained beloved until the end. The press never stopped following her, and she never stopped smiling. She aged with grace, outlasted history, and walked out of the White House exactly the way she'd walked in, unbothered, unrushed, unforgettable. Frances Cleveland wasn't just the First Lady, she was the first modern First Lady. She understood media before media understood itself. She turned personal charm into public capital. She walked the line between fantasy and power, and never once stumbled. She was not tragic, not controversial, not tragic then redeemed. She was simply excellent at being looked at, and in the world of American politics, that's more dangerous than it sounds. But after glamour comes gravity. The next First Lady didn't care for fashion columns. She ran a home, lost a daughter, and guarded her president like a hawk circling his enemies. Caroline Harrison, Benjamin Harrison, Caroline Lavinia. Scott Harrison was not a household name, but she ran the White House like it was one. She didn't flirt with the press. She didn't dazzle in diamonds. She didn't need to, because Caroline Harrison had no interest in being seen. She wanted to be useful. And in 4 short years, she left behind a legacy made not of fanfare, but of function. She reorganized the residence, rescued history from mildew, brought women to the table, and quietly died while the nation wasn't looking. Caroline Scott was born in 1832 in Ohio, into a family that believed in education, modesty, and duty. Her father was a college professor and minister. Her mother, a quiet activist who taught her that real change doesn't always come from speeches. Sometimes it comes from organization. She met Benjamin Harrison at college. They married in 1853. She taught music. He practiced law. She raised 2 children, hosted with care, and endured the slow climb of her husband's political life, from Civil War officer to senator to presidential candidate. When he won the 1888 election, defeating Grover Cleveland, Caroline stepped into a role she had never asked for. She wore it like a fitted glove. Caroline Harrison approached the First Ladyship like a project manager. She found the White House in a state of dignified disrepair. The plumbing outdated, the furniture moldy, the structure literally crumbling. She proposed the first serious renovation since the 1850s, drafted plans for expansion, pushed for electrical wiring, upgraded heating systems. She created what we now call the White House China Collection, preserving dishes from earlier administrations and designing new ones with patriotic themes, a quiet act of symbolic continuity. She didn't just redecorate, she archived. She was the First Lady to preserve the past while building for the future, and she did it without fanfare, without headlines, without ever asking for credit. She also restructured White House staff roles, curated menus, and began keeping inventories, because nothing says American legacy like knowing exactly how many teaspoons went missing during the Austrian delegation's visit. But Caroline Harrison didn't just oversee china patterns and floor plans. She was a firm believer in women's education and public life. She became the first president of the Daughters of the American Revolution, DAR, helping launch the organization in 1890 and quietly steering its mission in a way that made male lawmakers very uncomfortable. She hosted female scholars at the White House, pushed for more space for working women in government, advocated for kindergarten programs and public health reform. She wasn't loud about it, but she was everywhere. And yet, the country barely noticed, distracted as always by whatever louder crisis came next, until she got sick. By 1892, Caroline Harrison was dying. Tuberculosis, slow, suffocating, inescapable, began claiming her breath, her strength, and eventually her place in the East Room. She stopped appearing at events. Her daughter Mary took over hostess duties. Benjamin refused to leave her side. State dinners were canceled. The electric lights she'd insisted on installing burned softly behind closed doors. She died in the White House on October 25th, 1892, just weeks before her husband lost his re-election bid to Grover Cleveland. Her funeral was small, formal, quiet, the way she lived. No scandal, no parade, just legacy, boxed and labeled for the next occupant. Caroline Harrison doesn't appear on favorite first lady polls. She's not cited in fashion retrospectives. She didn't write memoirs. She wrote order forms. And yet, every modern first lady who curates a collection, preserves the past, or shapes the physical White House owes her a footnote. She was the first to treat the executive mansion like an archive, not a costume party. She left it more organized, more respected, more stable, even as her own lungs failed her on the second floor. Her power wasn't symbolic. It was practical, and in Washington, that's rare enough to feel revolutionary. Mary Harrison McKee, Benjamin Harrison. There are first ladies who arrive with press clippings. There are first ladies who build the role around themselves. And then there are women like Mary Harrison McKee, who stepped into the East Room not out of ambition, but out of grief. When Caroline Harrison died in 1892, the first lady to die in the White House since Letitia Tyler, her daughter Mary quietly assumed the duties of White House hostess. She didn't make a public announcement. She didn't take a title. She just put on her gloves and kept the house running. It was a ceremonial continuation, a living placeholder, a daughter doing what her mother would have wanted, and America barely noticed. Mary Scott Harrison was born in 1858. The only daughter of Benjamin and Caroline Harrison, she was well-educated, socially polished, and raised in the political glow of her father's ambition. In 1884, she married James McKee, a wealthy businessman. They had 2 children and lived a life of comfortable distance from Washington until Benjamin Harrison became president in 1889, and the family was swept into the White House orbit. Mary returned to help her mother with official duties, hosting when needed, managing staff, handling floral arrangements, and keeping the wheels turning in the increasingly ceremonial side of executive power. She didn't shine. She functioned. And when Caroline's health began to decline, it was Mary who stepped in, not to take over, but to hold things together. By late 1892, Caroline Harrison was dying of tuberculosis. The White House turned inward. The chandeliers were dimmed. Events were canceled or muted. Mary became the de facto first lady. She greeted guests, oversaw the planning of state functions, wore black to every event, managed staff with her mother's precision, but without her mother's presence. She wasn't flamboyant, she wasn't adored, but she was respected, in that quiet, upper-crust Protestant way that prefers competence over charisma. Her father, who was preparing for re-election, leaned on her heavily. The public mostly ignored her because Mary didn't come with sparkle. She came with loss, and there's nothing the American press is worse at processing than a woman who performs grief without needing their permission. Caroline Harrison died on October 25th, 1892, just weeks before the presidential election. Mary kept things moving, hosting small events, responding to condolence letters, dressing the rooms for the holidays her mother would never see. But Benjamin Harrison lost the election to Grover Cleveland again. And with that, Mary's brief window of national presence closed. She returned to private life with her husband and children. She never sought public office, never sought legacy, never wrote memoirs, but her family would not remain untouched by power. Decades later, her son, Benjamin Harrison McKee, the White House toddler once known to staff as Baby McKee, would become a footnote in presidential trivia. But Mary herself, she remains the invisible matron of a broken chapter in First Lady history. Mary Harrison McKee's first ladyship wasn't formal. It wasn't glamorous. And it wasn't voluntary. But it was real. She showed up, wore black, took her mother's place, and then walked away. Without asking for applause or recognition, she was the embodied pause between one woman's legacy and the next, a bridge made of protocol, mourning, and quiet resolve. And she reminds us that sometimes being first lady doesn't mean being first in anything. It just means showing up when the job is impossible and doing it anyway. But the next first lady had no time for grief or ghosts. She married a sitting president in his second term. She was a teacher, a mother, a social powerhouse. And her second term would become her husband's last, and the country's turning point. Francis Cleveland, again. Grover Cleveland, again. 4 years after leaving the White House with a confident promise, "We'll be back." Francis Cleveland kept it. When her husband, Grover Cleveland, returned to office in 1893, the country braced for déjà vu. But Frances wasn't the same woman. She was still young, only 29, but now she was a mother, a celebrity with mileage, and a first lady who every step was shadowed by expectation. And this time, she wasn't just a bride. She was a buffer between a country collapsing into financial chaos and a president increasingly defined by a stubborn detachment. She made it look effortless. It wasn't. Cleveland's second term began with a national economic meltdown. The Panic of 1893, one of the worst financial depressions in U.S. history, sent banks crashing, businesses folding, and millions of Americans into unemployment. Protests, strikes, hunger, and at the center of it, a president who refused to hand out easy solutions. Cleveland was aloof. Frances was anything but. She stepped back into her role with the same natural charm that had enchanted the press years earlier. But this time, she added discipline, no more starstruck debutante. Now, she was managing children, reputation, and a White House under siege from public frustration and congressional inertia. Frances Cleveland made history again, this time as the first lady to give birth in the White House. In 1893, she delivered Esther Cleveland, their second daughter, in the executive residence, turning the East Wing into a national nursery. Newspapers rejoiced. Cartoonists softened. For a moment, the public remembered what they liked about the Clevelands. But it was brief. The country was still starving, and the president, well, he was keeping a secret. In the middle of the economic collapse, Grover Cleveland was diagnosed with oral cancer. He underwent a secret surgery, on a yacht no less, where doctors removed part of his upper jaw and fitted him with a prosthetic. The operation was kept completely hidden from the public. Frances knew. Frances managed it. She maintained appearances, calmed suspicion, smiled through dinners. No one ever saw her panic, not even when they asked why the president's face looked a little different. The country never found out until years later. Behind the scenes, Frances Cleveland was holding together a sick husband, an economic disaster, 2 toddlers, and the entire social machinery of the White House. Without ever raising her voice, she was running a government without signing a bill. Despite the darkness of her husband's second term, Frances remained wildly popular. She was still fashion-forward, still graceful, still incredibly good at managing public opinion. Reporters obsessed over her wardrobe, her children, her opinions, and unlike most political wives, Frances didn't retreat. She started giving public speeches, a rarity at the time for first ladies, often on education and women's welfare. She visited schools and hospitals. She didn't push for suffrage, but she elevated the idea that women could be politically adjacent. Visible, thoughtful, informed, she didn't change the world. She made it slightly more willing to imagine a woman who might. When Cleveland's second term ended in 1897, the couple, and now their 3 daughters and 2 sons, left Washington for good. This time, there was no promise to return. Frances lived for another 50 years after leaving the White House. She remarried after Grover's death, to a professor, quietly, without scandal. She supported World War I relief efforts, education reform, and even women's suffrage, though only late in life. She died in 1947, the longest living first lady at the time of her death. She had lived through 2 non-consecutive presidencies, 2 world wars, radio, automobiles, and women getting the right to vote, all while being remembered by millions as the nation's original charming, unbreakable political partner. Frances Cleveland's story isn't just about youth or beauty. It's about return, about how charm can age into resilience, about how performance can grow into power. She didn't reform the system, but she moved in it with such skill, grace, and political instinct that she made it look like it belonged to her, and maybe in some ways it did. But as Frances rode into quiet domestic life, the next First Lady was staring down a harsher task. She had to face the public after her husband was shot, again, and this time she would bury him. Absolutely correct. You're paying close attention, and I love it. After Caroline Harrison passed away in 1892, during her husband's presidency, the role of First Lady didn't vanish. It passed, quietly, temporarily, and with very little fanfare, to her daughter, Mary Scott Harrison McKee.